The wagon wheels screamed like a dying animal, a sound lost in the vast, indifferent silence of the moon-bleached desert. Jason Ward's hands, raw and split, clenched the reins until his knuckles were bone-white against the bruised skin. Behind him, the town of Redemption was a fading smear of flickering lantern light, a place that had offered him nothing of the sort. Ahead lay only darkness pierced by the cold, distant glitter of stars. He risked a glance over his shoulder into the wagon bed. His daughter Ellen slept fitfully, a pale slip of a thing curled beneath a threadbare blanket. Her small hand was fisted around a tarnished silver locket, the last tangible piece of her mother left in this world. The moonlight caught the worn floral engravings, a ghostly reminder of a life that felt a lifetime away. Jason's ribs throbbed with a dull, insistent ache, a souvenir from the men who had thrown him out of Silas Blackwood's office only hours before. The memory was a fresh, bleeding wound. The cloying scent of cigar smoke and expensive leather in Blackwood's office. The condescending smirk on the land baron's face as he slid Jason's deed, the original deed to the Ward homestead, across the polished mahogany desk. A charming piece of history, Mr. Ward Blackwood had purred his voice as smooth and cold as Riverstone. But history, I'm afraid, does not pay taxes. Your father's debt is now my property. And I find I have a fondness for the view. Jason's plea, born of pure desperation, had been met with a quiet signal. Two large men had hauled him to his feet. This town has no room for failures, Blackwood had said calmly, straightening his silk tie. Find your future elsewhere. The future. Jason tasted blood and dust. The future was a 7-year-old girl sleeping in the back of a rickety wagon, a lame horse, and the $3 in his pocket that represented the entirety of his worldly wealth. Now, under the cold watch of the moon, the desperation was a physical thing, a hollow ache in his gut that was worse than any beating. They were adrift, a tiny broken vessel on an ocean of sand and rock. Every rattle of the wagon was a countdown to the inevitable moment when their meager supplies ran out, when the horse finally gave out, when the vast, empty landscape swallowed them whole. He looked at Ellen again, at the way her brow furrowed in her sleep, and a protective fire burned through the exhaustion. He had failed her. He had failed the memory of his wife, Sarah. But he would not fail her again. He would find a way. He had to. The silver locket gleamed, a silent accusation and a solemn promise in the pale, unforgiving light. 2 days later, the hope that had flickered in the moonlight had been baked into dust by a relentless, punishing sun. The horse's head hung low, and the water in their canteen was warm and tasted of tin. They limped into a settlement that was little more than a collection of sun-bleached shacks huddled around a muddy water trough, a place called Last Chance. The name felt like a cruel joke. Jason left Ellen and their scruffy dog Zeus in the shade of a dilapidated livery, promising her a piece of hardtack from their dwindling supplies. He walked into the land office, the air thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unfulfilled dreams. Behind a desk cluttered with yellowed maps sat a man with shifty eyes and a tremor in his hands. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb. Looking for land, Webb asked, his gaze darting around the room as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. Looking for cheap land. Jason corrected his voice, raspy from thirst. He laid his $3 on the desk. The coins were dull, worn smooth by the hands of countless others who had likely been just as desperate. This is all I have. Webb's eyes fixed on the coins, a flicker of something unreadable, greed, or perhaps fear in their depths. He licked his lips and pulled a rolled-up deed from a dusty pigeonhole. He didn't even try to haggle. I have just the parcel, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. 160 acres. Remote. Private. He unrolled the deed. The land was a formless blotch in the middle of nowhere, a section designated only by coordinates. At the top, scrawled in faded ink, was its unofficial name, the Devil's Anvil. Why so cheap? Jason asked the name, sending a prickle of unease down his spine. Webb's hands trembled as he pushed a pen and inkpot toward Jason. Previous owner. Left in a hurry. Unsettled business. He avoided Jason's gaze, focusing instead on a fly buzzing near the window. Some folks say it's cursed. Bad soil, no water. But a deed is a deed. It's a place to stand, isn't it? A place to stand. That was more than they had now. Desperation was a powerful motivator, strong enough to silence the screaming alarms in his head. Jason signed the paper, the scratch of the nib, and the only sound in the tense silence. Webb snatched the coins and stuffed the deed into Jason's hand, nearly pushing him out the door. "Good luck to you, mister," he said, his relief palpable. "You're gonna need it." As Jason walked back to the wagon, the deed felt unnaturally heavy in his hand. He had just spent his last $3 on a piece of land called the Devil's Anvil, sold to him by a man running from ghosts. It wasn't a gamble. It was a prayer whispered into a hurricane. The ride to their new home was a journey into desolation. The cracked earth thirsted for rain that never came, and the only signs of life were skeletal saguaro cacti, their arms raised to the sky in a permanent gesture of surrender. The afternoon sun bled across the horizon, turning the red sand to shimmering glass and casting long, haunting shadows. As they crossed the boundary line, marked by a rusted strand of barbed wire, Ellen, who had been quiet for hours, suddenly sat up. "Papa," she said, her voice small against the immense silence. "Look at the stones." Jason followed her pointing finger. Scattered across the bleak terrain were dozens of circles made of dark, heavy rocks. They were too deliberate to be natural formations, too weathered and ancient to be recent. They looked like the forgotten altars of some long-dead tribe. As the wagon creaked closer, Zeus, who had been dozing at Ellen's feet, began to whine a low guttural sound of distress. His ears flattened against his head, and the fur on his neck bristled. "Probably just old campsites," Jason muttered, though the words lacked any conviction. The air here felt different, heavy, watchful. He brought the wagon to a halt near the largest of the stone circles. Ellen, her childlike curiosity overriding any fear, hopped down and ran toward it, her worn boots kicking up puffs of red dust. Zeus followed, but his movements were hesitant, his body low to the ground. "Ellen, be careful," Jason called, his own senses on high alert. She stopped dead in the center of the circle, her head cocked, as if listening to something only she could hear. "Papa," she called back, her voice strangely hushed. "You should come look at this." Jason walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil. Inside the ring of stones, the earth was different. It was a darker shade of brown, and softer, as if it had been disturbed and then meticulously replaced. The patch of disturbed earth formed a perfect rectangle, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The shape was unmistakable. It was the precise dimensions of a grave. Ellen knelt beside it, her small hand hovering just above the surface. "Something's down there, Papa," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Something big." Zeus had stopped whining. Now he sat perfectly still, his gaze locked on that rectangular patch of earth with an unnerving intensity. Webb's warning echoed in Jason's mind. There's a reason it's so cheap. They had no money, no food beyond a few days' rations, and owned nothing but a plot of cursed land marked with what looked like a freshly filled grave. There was no going back. Whatever lay buried beneath that carefully disguised rectangle of earth was now part of their story. The only question was whether digging it up would be their salvation or their damnation. A metallic tang, faint but sharp, hung in the dry air. It grew stronger as Jason began clawing at the loose dirt with his bare hands. Ellen worked beside him, her small fingers surprisingly nimble, both of them driven by a primal curiosity that overshadowed their weariness. Zeus paced the perimeter of the stone circle, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "I'll get the shovel," Jason said, his voice rough. But Ellen was already inches deep, her hands moving with a frantic energy. "Papa, look," she whispered, her voice tight with excitement. Jason leaned into the shallow hole she'd dug. Beneath the thin layer of topsoil, something gleamed, not the dull brown of buried wood or the flat gray of rock. This was a bright, metallic sheen reflecting the dying sunlight. He retrieved the shovel from the wagon, his heart hammering against his bruised ribs. He worked carefully now, aware that a single careless strike could damage whatever lay hidden. With each scoop of earth, more of the object was revealed. It was a box, just as Ellen had predicted, but its scale was startling. It was easily the size of a coffin, fashioned from thick, dark metal that seemed to have resisted years of moisture and decay. But it wasn't the size that stopped Jason's breath. It was the sheer, immovable weight. He tried to pry up one corner with the shovel's edge, and the wooden handle groaned in protest, the box barely shifting an inch. "Papa, what could be so heavy?" Ellen breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. Jason had hauled his share of grain sacks and anvils. He knew the weight of honest labor. This was different. This was the dense, unyielding weight of something precious, of metals far heavier than iron. Suddenly, Zeus erupted into a volley of sharp, urgent barks, his attention fixed not on the grave, but on the horizon. Jason looked up, his hand tightening on the shovel. A lone rider was approaching, a dark silhouette moving swiftly across the shimmering desert floor. "Ellen, get behind the wagon." Now Jason commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing Zeus by his frayed rope collar and pulling him with her. Jason stood his ground, and the shovel held across his chest like a makeshift weapon. The rider could be a lost traveler, a curious neighbor, or, and this thought chilled him to the bone, someone who knew exactly what was buried in this God-forsaken place. The rider slowed his horse to a walk as he approached, finally coming to a halt just outside the largest stone circle. He was a weathered man in dark, practical clothing, his face shadowed by the wide brim of his hat. His gaze swept over the scene, the exhausted man, the partially excavated hole, and the glint of the massive metal chest. "Afternoon." The stranger called out, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that held no trace of friendliness. "Seems you folks have been busy." Jason planted his feet, positioning himself protectively between the stranger and the chest. "Just settling in. This is our property now." A dry, mirthless chuckle escaped the stranger's lips. "New property, is it?" He dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, every movement radiating a quiet confidence that set Jason's teeth on edge. Funny thing about this particular piece of land. Previous owner, a man named Dutch Henley, left in quite a hurry. Didn't even pack his belongings. Jason's grip on the shovel tightened until his knuckles ached. "The deed is signed. The land is mine." "Oh, I'm sure it is," the stranger said, taking a step closer. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were locked on the exposed corner of the metal container. "Question is, did the man who sold it to you have the right to sell it in the first place?" A muffled whisper came from behind the wagon as Ellen tried to soothe the still growling Zeus. Jason couldn't make out the words, but he saw the stranger's hand drift down, coming to rest casually on the worn leather grip of the pistol holstered at his hip. And in that moment, Jason understood. Their desperate gamble had just become a deadly confrontation. The stranger's gaze never wavered from the metal chest. "Name's Caleb Morton," he said, his voice carrying the weight of unfinished business. "I worked for Dutch Henley. He was an honest man right up until he vanished 3 months ago." Jason kept the shovel at the ready, a flimsy defense against the threat Morton represented. "Don't know anything about that. We bought this land legal." From whom Morton's question was sharp as a shard of glass. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Jason's mind went blank. In his haste and desperation, he'd never even asked the seller's name. Morton nodded, a grim understanding dawning on his face. Tall fellow, twitchy hands kept looking over his shoulder like the devil himself was on his trail. A cold knot formed in Jason's stomach. The description was perfect. That would be Marcus Webb Morton continued taking another deliberate step forward. Dutch's business partner. The same partner who owed Dutch a considerable sum of money right before he disappeared. Suddenly, Ellen's voice, high and clear, pierced the tension. Papa Zeus is acting strange again. Jason glanced back. The dog had broken away from Ellen and was now digging frantically at the base of another smaller stone circle 50 feet away, dirt flying from beneath his paws. Whatever scent he'd caught was driving him into a frenzy. Morton's gaze followed Jason's, and a cold, predatory smile touched his lips. Well, I'll be. Looks like there might be more than one buried treasure on this property. The implication hit Jason with the force of a physical blow. If there were multiple caches, if Zeus was reacting to other sites, then this wasn't just a hidden strongbox. This was a network, a system. This was a fortune. I'll make this simple. Morton set his hand, now resting firmly on the butt of his gun. That container doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to Webb either. It belongs to Dutch Henley. And Dutch, before he vanished, worked for some very serious people. What kind of people? Jason heard himself ask the words, feeling foreign in his own mouth. Morton's smile vanished, replaced by a chilling seriousness. The kind who don't leave loose ends. The kind who've been searching for Dutch and his missing cargo for 3 long months. The kind who would be very, very interested to know that cargo has finally been located. Just then, Ellen emerged from behind the wagon, her face pale, but her eyes bright with discovery. She held up a single dirt-encrusted coin. Papa Zeus found something else. Another box, a small one. It was already cracked open. She held out the coin, its surface gleaming gold in the fading light. Morton's expression transformed instantly. The calculated patience was gone, replaced by a raw, hungry avarice. Well, now, he breathed, his voice a low hiss. Seems Dutch was more enterprising than anyone realized. Jason's mind was a whirlwind. Multiple burial sites, gold coins, a missing man with connections to a dangerous syndicate. They hadn't just stumbled upon a solution to their problems. They had unearthed a new, deadlier set of them. And as Morton's calculating gaze shifted from the coin to Ellen, Jason knew their troubles were just beginning. Morton's calculating eyes lingered on Ellen, and then on the gold coin she clutched in her small hand. Smart little girl you have there. Good at finding things. The veiled threat in his voice made Jason's blood run cold. Ellen, get back behind the wagon, Jason ordered. Now hold on, Morton said, raising a placating hand, though his eyes remained hard. No need for the child to hide. In fact, she might be exactly what we need. His smile was that of a wolf circling its prey. You see, Dutch Henley was a cautious man. The syndicate he worked for, they moved payrolls, bullion, big money. Word is, he didn't bury his score in one place. He scattered it across this property in caches of varying sizes. Some in places a grown man might never think to look. Jason stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Morton and his daughter. She's not part of this. Oh, but she is now. Morton countered his hand, returning to his pistol. Because that coin she's holding, that's just a taste. And I'm betting a curious child and her digging dog can find the rest a lot faster than I can on my own. Ellen's voice, small but clear, cut through the tension. Papa, there's writing on the coin. Strange letters. Morton's eyes sharpened with interest. Let me see that. Don't move, Ellen, Jason commanded, raising the shovel to a defensive position. Morton laughed, a harsh grating sound. You're going to fight me with a farming tool. I've got 6 bullets that say that's a bad idea. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked, echoing in the stillness. Now let's all be reasonable. I need to find Dutch's complete stash before his former employers do. You and your girl need to keep breathing. Seems to me we can help each other out. Jason felt the desert closing in around him. He was trapped between an armed man, a fortune he couldn't move, and the terrifying knowledge that even more dangerous men were on their way. But Ellen's safety was the only currency that mattered. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice strained. "Simple. We work together. Your daughter and that dog of hers helped me locate every last cache on this property. In return, I let you keep a share. Enough to start over somewhere far from here." Morton's expression hardened. "Refuse, and I'll just wait. The syndicate men Dutch stole from won't be nearly as generous. They'll take the gold, and they'll bury the three of you right alongside it to keep things tidy." Ellen gasped, her eyes fixed on the coin in her palm. "Papa, there are words on both sides." She turned the coin over in her small fingers. "This side says one thing, but when I flip it, it says something different." Morton lowered his pistol slightly, his professional curiosity overriding his menace. "What does it say, child?" Ellen squinted at the worn engravings, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This side has numbers, maybe coordinates. But the other side?" She flipped it again, her small thumb rubbing away a bit of grime. "It's like directions." 20 paces from the tallest stone, a sudden realization struck Jason. Ellen's young eyes were sharper than his own, catching details on the tarnished surface that an adult might miss. Her sensitive fingers could feel the subtle indentations of engravings that years in the earth had nearly erased. Morton was realizing it too. His gaze on Ellen was no longer just threatening. It was appraising, like a jeweler examining a rare gem. He saw her not just as leverage, but as a key. And in that shift, Jason saw their only path to survival. 20 paces from the tallest stone. Morton repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Dutch, you clever devil. Each coin must be a clue to the next." He surveyed the landscape, his eyes landing on the most prominent of the stone circles, a formation stacked higher than a man's head, about 50 yards away. He gestured with his pistol toward Jason. "You, start walking from that tall stone. The girl stays here with me." "No," Jason said, his voice hard as iron. "We go together, or this deal is off." He met Morton's gaze without flinching. For the first time since the rider had appeared, Jason felt he had a sliver of control. Ellen was the map, and he was her protector. Morton's jaw tightened. He weighed his options for a long, tense moment. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine. But the dog stays. As insurance." Ellen reluctantly handed Zeus's rope to Morton, her eyes pleading with her father to be careful. Together they walked toward the tallest stone circle, the setting sun casting their long shadows before them. Jason counted each step aloud, his boots crunching on the dry, unforgiving ground. 18, 19, 20. They stopped at a patch of earth that looked identical to every other patch around it. But Ellen knelt just as she had before, and pressed her ear to the ground. She tapped the surface with her knuckles. "Papa, listen," she whispered. Jason crouched beside her. She was right. The sound was hollow, resonant, completely different from the solid thud of the earth just a few feet away. "There's something big down here," Ellen said, her voice filled with a hushed reverence. They dug with their hands, Morton watching intently, his pistol never straying far from them. Within minutes, Jason's fingers scraped against cold, hard metal. This chest was even larger than the first, a massive iron-bound coffer that took all their combined strength just to clear the dirt from its lid. Jason called out, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You need to see this." Morton approached, his caution warring with his greed. When he saw the sheer size of the container, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Good heavens," he muttered. Dutch wasn't just skimming. He stole the whole damn payroll. It took the three of them, using the shovel as a lever, to pry open the heavy, rusted lid. The last rays of the setting sun poured into the opening, and the contents ignited with a brilliant, blinding light. The chest was filled to the brim with gold coins, packed so tightly they formed a solid, shimmering surface. But beneath the top layer, Jason could see more stacks of silver bars, leather-wrapped jewelry, and cloth bundles that hinted at untold riches. Ellen reached in and carefully unwrapped one of the bundles. Inside lay an emerald the size of a robin's egg, its deep green facets catching the light and scattering it in 1,000 directions. Morton lowered his weapon completely, his voice a stunned whisper. This is a king's ransom. Enough to buy half the territory. Jason's mind reeled. With this, Ellen would have everything. A real home and education, a future free from the fear and poverty that had haunted their lives. But as he looked at Morton's face, illuminated by the golden glow from the chest, he saw the man's mind already at work, calculating shares, planning betrayals. This fortune hadn't saved them. It had just raised the stakes to a level they might not survive. Morton stared into the chest, his face a mask of avarice and fear. This changes everything, he breathed. Dutch didn't just steal from the syndicate. He stole their entire treasury. Ellen, seemingly untouched by the greed that had seized Morton, carefully rewrapped the emerald. There are more coins with writing on them, Papa. Should I read them? Before anyone could answer, the faint, rhythmic drumming of approaching horses carried on the evening breeze. It wasn't one rider. It was several moving fast. Morton's head snapped up, his face instantly paling. They found us. He grabbed Jason's arm, his grip like a vice. How many more caches are there? I don't know, Jason answered honestly. Then we find out. Fast, Morton hissed, his desperation now a palpable force. Because those riders aren't here to negotiate. From a ridge a half-mile distant, Jason saw them, 5 dark figures silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. They were riding hard, closing the distance with grim purpose. In that heart-stopping moment, Jason spotted another figure on a separate ridge, a lone man on a fine black horse, watching the approaching riders and their own small party through a spyglass. The man's posture was rigid, authoritative. It was Silas Blackwood. The truth slammed into Jason with sickening force. This was no coincidence. Blackwood hadn't just run him out of town. He had herded him here to this specific piece of land. The nervous seller, the cheap price, the convenient discovery, it was all a setup. This wasn't about land or old debts. This was a trap. Ellen, oblivious to the new terrifying dimension of their plight, had already pulled 3 more coins from the chest. This one says, "Beneath the broken stone." This one, "Where the shadow falls longest at midday." And this one. She squinted. It says, "Follow the dog's nose to the sweet earth." As if on cue, Zeus, who had been tied to the wagon, suddenly snapped his frayed rope. He barked once, then took off toward a patch of land where a few stubborn desert wildflowers grew his nose to the ground. Sweet earth, Jason repeated, the cleverness of the clue dawning on him. The soil near the flowers would smell different. The syndicate riders were closer now, their features becoming clear. They were hard-faced men, rifles held ready across their saddles. Morton made a split-second decision that defied all of Jason's expectations. "Take your daughter and the dog," he ordered, his voice urgent and sharp. "Find what you can. Fill your wagon. Go." "What about you?" Jason asked, stunned. A grim smile touched Morton's lips as he checked the cylinder of his revolver. "I'm going to buy you some time." He took cover behind the largest of the stone circles. "Those men want the whole prize. I'll try to convince them it's not worth the price." It was a suicide mission, but it was also their only chance. Jason didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ellen's hand and ran toward Zeus, who was already digging at the spot near the wildflowers. He unearthed a smaller metal box, heavy for its size. Jason pried it open. It was filled with more gold, but also several leather pouches. He tore one open, and a cascade of cut diamonds spilled into his palm, sparkling like captured starlight in the twilight. "Papa, we're rich," Ellen gasped. "Really, truly rich." But the sound of the first gunshot from Morton's position shattered the moment. Jason looked back and saw the 5 riders charging, their own guns blazing. He looked toward the other ridge. Blackwood was still there, watching a silent, malevolent puppeteer observing his creation. "Ellen, to the wagon!" Now Jason shouted over the growing din of the gunfight. They frantically loaded the box of diamonds and 2 other small chests they had managed to unearth. Gunshots cracked through the air bullets, whining past them. Morton was holding his own, using the ancient stones for cover, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Jason whipped the horse into a desperate gallop, the wagon lurching violently over the uneven terrain. Behind them, the desert had erupted into a pocket of hell lit by flashes of gunpowder. Ellen huddled in the wagon bed, clutching Zeus, her small face a mask of terror. "Is Mr. Morton going to be okay?" she cried. Jason couldn't answer. He urged the horse onward, away from the chaos, away from the treasure, and away from the cold, watchful eyes of Silas Blackwood. As they crested a ridge, he risked one last look back. The gunfight was still raging, but it was clear Morton's stand was a losing one. The fortune they had discovered was now a symbol not of hope, but of a deadly game. They had been forced to play a game in which they were merely pawns. And the true player was still watching from the hills, his motives as dark and vast as the coming night. The wagon careened through the twilight, every rock and rut a jarring impact that threatened to shatter its aging frame. The echo of gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the frantic pounding of the horse's hooves and Jason's own laboring heart. They were alive. They had escaped. But they were running blind fugitives in a land that offered no sanctuary. As darkness fell completely, Jason found a hidden arroyo, a deep scar in the earth that offered concealment from the main trail. He brought the exhausted horse to a halt. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and Ellen's quiet, ragged sobs. He gathered her into his arms, her small body trembling. "It's all right, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "We're safe now." But he knew it was a lie. Blackwood had orchestrated this. He had manipulated Jason, pushed him onto this specific piece of land, knowing what was buried there. The gold wasn't the prize. It was the bait. And Jason had taken it, leading them straight into a conflict between Morton and the syndicate. Blackwood had wanted chaos. He had wanted bloodshed. The question that burned in Jason's mind was why. What could he possibly gain from such a convoluted and deadly scheme? The answer came to him slowly, a chilling whisper in the back of his mind. This wasn't about money. It was personal. Blackwood's cold dismissal and redemption, the calculated cruelty, the specific choice of the devil's anvil, it all pointed to a motive far deeper and more twisted than simple greed. A violent sandstorm, a demon of wind and dust, rolled in from the west, blotting out the stars. The wind howled through the arroyo, whipping sand into their faces and threatening to tear the canvas cover from the wagon. It was as if the land itself was trying to erase them. Trapped and blinded by the storm, Jason huddled with Ellen and Zeus, the weight of their stolen treasure a cold, heavy burden beside them. Hours later, as the storm began to abate, the sound of a horse's steady footsteps approached their hiding place. Jason's hand went to the shovel, the only weapon he had. A figure emerged from the swirling dust leading a horse. It was Caleb Morton. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, and his left arm hung limp at his side. But he was alive. "Figured you'd find a place to hole up," Morton rasped, slumping against the rock wall of the arroyo. "Uncle, those syndicate boys weren't expecting a fight. Gave them more trouble than they bargained for. We thought you were—" Jason started. Dead Morton finished with a grimace. "Almost. Slipped away when the storm hit. They're scattered looking for me and the rest of the treasure." He looked at Jason, his eyes sharp and serious despite his injuries. "But they're not the real problem, are they? You saw him too, didn't you? Up on the ridge." "Blackwood," Jason nodded. "He sent us here." "He did more than that," Morton said, wincing as he tried to shift his position. Dutch Henley didn't just work for the syndicate. He used to work for Blackwood years ago. They had a falling out, a bad one. Whatever Dutch stole, whatever secret he buried out there, Blackwood wants it back, or he wants it to stay buried. The pieces were beginning to form a dark, terrifying picture. Before Jason could process it, another voice cut through the wind, cold and precise. An astute observation, Mr. Morton. Though your timeline is slightly off. Silas Blackwood stood at the edge of the arroyo, flanked by two of his men. He was immaculate, his fine coat barely dusted by the storm, his posture one of utter command. He wasn't looking at the treasure in the wagon. His burning gaze was fixed solely on Jason. The gold is an irrelevance. Blackwood said, his voice laced with a chilling calm. A convenient excuse to draw out the rats. The real treasure buried on that landward is a memory. He took a step down into the arroyo, his men holding their rifles ready. 5 years ago, there was a fire. A tragic accident at a small way station that used to stand on that very plot of land. An overturned lantern, they said. It claimed the lives of a young family passing through, a man, his wife, and their 2 small sons. He paused, his eyes glittering with a cold, unholy light. It also claimed the life of another woman, a woman who was supposed to meet her husband there. Your wife, Sarah. Jason felt the world tilt on its axis. Sarah. He had told her to wait for him at that way station while he went to town for supplies. By the time he returned, it was gone, reduced to ash and sorrow. They told him she had died in the fire, a victim of a terrible accident. It was no accident, Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Dutch Henley was there. He set the fire to cover his tracks after a robbery. But you were supposed to be there with her. You were late. Your incompetence, your tardiness, cost my family their lives. Blackwood's composure finally cracked, revealing the raw, bottomless grief beneath. The family that died in the fire. They were his wife, his sons. I have spent 5 years planning this. Blackwood continued, his voice trembling with rage. I ruined you, drove you from your home, and forced you onto that cursed ground. I wanted you to dig in the same earth that holds the ashes of my family. I wanted you to feel the weight of what you had done. The gold was merely the means to bring you to your final judgment. The syndicate, Morton, the treasure. They were all just scenery in Blackwood's grand, horrific play of revenge. He wasn't a land baron. He was a hangman, and this desolate patch of desert was his gallows. The sandstorm, which had momentarily subsided, returned with a vengeance. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the world dissolved into a blinding maelstrom of ochre dust. In the chaos, the syndicate riders, drawn by the voices, stumbled upon the arroyo. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Blackwood's men returned fire, turning the narrow canyon into a deadly crossfire. Morton, despite his injury, drew his pistol and pulled Jason and Ellen toward the relative safety of the wagon. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, the sound lost in the roar of the storm. It was a chaotic, swirling battle where friend and foe were indistinguishable shadows in the dust. Jason's mind was reeling from Blackwood's revelation. Guilt, a companion he had carried for 5 long years, now had a name and a face. He had always blamed himself for being late, for not being there to protect Sarah. Now a man consumed by his own grief was blaming him too, and was ready to kill him for it. Through a momentary lull in the wind, Jason saw Blackwood advancing, his face a mask of pure hatred, a dueling pistol in his hand. This was it, the reckoning he had engineered. But as Jason prepared to face him, Morton shoved him hard. "Get your girl out of here," he yelled over the storm. "This ain't your fight to die in." A bullet struck Morton in the shoulder, spinning him around. He slumped against the wagon wheel, his gun clattering to the ground. Chaos reigned. The syndicate men were locked in a desperate firefight with Blackwood's enforcers. And in the heart of the storm, Silas Blackwood was closing in his personal vendetta, about to reach its bloody conclusion. Jason dragged the wounded Morton and a terrified Ellen to the one place that offered any shelter, the ruins of an old abandoned saloon on the edge of the property, a relic from the way station that had burned down. The sandstorm raged outside, rattling the boarded-up windows and screaming through the cracks in the walls. The air inside was thick with the ghosts of the past. The saloon door crashed open, and Silas Blackwood stepped inside, the wind tearing at his coat. The storm had stripped away his veneer of civilized control, leaving only the raw, grieving predator beneath. His eyes, wild with pain and fury, found Jason's in the dim, dust-filled light. Here at last, Blackwood rasped, his voice raw. On the very ground where my world ended. Where you let my sons burn. I didn't know, Jason said, his own voice hollow. I swear to you, I never knew anyone else was there. Ignorance is not innocence. Blackwood roared, advancing on him. My wife, Elizabeth, my boys, Samuel and Thomas, they were everything. We were heading west to start a new life. We stopped for the night. And because you were late, because you failed your wife, my family paid the price. He lunged, not with a gun, but with his bare hands. The fight was brutal, clumsy, and fueled by 5 years of festering grief and guilt. They crashed through a rotting table, sending splinters flying. Jason was fighting for his life for Ellen, who was huddled behind the dilapidated bar, but Blackwood was fighting for ghosts, for a past that could never be reclaimed. Blackwood was stronger, his rage giving him an unholy power. He pinned Jason to the floor, his hands closing around Jason's throat. I'm going to send you to them. He choked out, his face contorted in a mask of agony. You can apologize to Sarah yourself. Jason's vision began to tunnel, the dust motes dancing in the dim light, blurring into darkness. He was losing. He was going to die here in the ashes of his and Blackwood's shared tragedy. Papa. Ellen's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the haze. He wrote it all down. Blackwood faltered his grip, loosening just enough for Jason to gasp for air. They both turned. Ellen stood there, her small frame trembling but her gaze resolute. She was holding a slim, oilskin-wrapped book. In her haste to find a hiding spot behind the bar, she had knocked over one of the treasure chests they'd salvaged. A false bottom had sprung open, revealing the book that had been hidden within. What is this? Blackwood demanded, his voice ragged. It's a journal, Ellen said, her voice shaking but firm. She held it out. It belonged to Dutch Henley. Slowly, as if in a trance, Blackwood released Jason and took the book. His hands trembled as he opened it. The pages were filled with a cramped, spidery script. Jason pushed himself up his throat raw and watched as Blackwood's eyes scanned the final entry, his face draining of all color. The journal was a confession. Dutch Henley, consumed by guilt in his final days, had detailed everything. He had robbed the way station, and to cover his tracks, he had set the fire, believing the building to be empty. He wrote of his horror when he realized there were people trapped inside. He wrote of seeing Jason's wagon approaching in the distance and fleeing into the night. And in the final damning lines, he confessed to starting the rumor that Jason Ward had been involved, a desperate act of self-preservation to deflect any suspicion from himself. He had created a scapegoat to appease the only man he feared, his former employer, Silas Blackwood. The truth, stark and terrible, hung in the air between them. Blackwood's entire crusade, the 5 years of meticulously planned revenge, his all-consuming hatred, it was all built on a lie. He had been aiming his fury at the wrong man, another victim of the same tragedy. The howling of the wind outside seemed to quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Blackwood sank to his knees, the journal falling from his lifeless fingers. A single broken sob escaped his lips, a sound of such profound despair, it seemed to tear the very soul from his body. He was no longer a monster. He was just a man shattered by a truth more painful than the one he had invented. As the first rays of dawn pierced the dusty gloom of the saloon, the sandstorm finally broke. A heavy silence descended, broken only by Blackwood's ragged breathing. He didn't look at Jason. He couldn't. He simply stared at the journal lying in the dust, the testament to his monumental tragic error. Jason rose to his feet, his body aching, his soul weary. He looked at the broken man kneeling before him. Every instinct screamed for retribution, for a final violent end to the nightmare. But looking at Blackwood's face, Jason saw not an enemy, but a mirror of his own grief. They were two men bound forever by a shared pyre. He walked over to Ellen and pulled her into a fierce embrace. Then he looked at Blackwood. "Get out," he said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a profound exhaustion. "Leave this place, and never come back." Without a word, Blackwood staggered to his feet and stumbled out of the saloon into the clean, crisp air of the new day. He didn't look back. His remaining men, seeing their leader broken, simply melted away into the desert. The syndicate riders were either dead or long gone, having fled the storm in the chaotic firefight. Jason found Caleb Morton propped against a wall, pale but conscious. He had managed to staunch the bleeding from his shoulder with a strip of cloth. Heard the whole thing. Morton rasped, gesturing toward the open doorway through which Blackwood had vanished. "Some stories, they don't have villains. Just ghosts." Jason nodded, surveying the aftermath. The treasure chests lay scattered, their contents spilling onto the dusty floor. The gold and diamonds that had promised a new life now seemed tainted symbols of the blood and sorrow that had been spilled to possess them. They were no longer a prize, but a burden. Weeks later, the Devil's Anvil was beginning to shed its name. The relentless sun still beat down, but now there was life. Jason had used a portion of the treasure to legally secure the deed and purchase the surrounding territory. He'd hired men to dig a deep well, and the sound of fresh, clean water being drawn was a music more beautiful than any song. A sturdy house was being built, its wooden frame a skeleton of hope against the blue sky. Caleb Morton, his arm now healing in a proper sling, oversaw the work, a pragmatic foreman who had decided to trade a life of prospecting for a chance at a home. Jason had given him a generous share of the fortune, enough to start over 10 times, but Morton had simply nodded and said, "I reckon I'll stay. The company's good." One cool evening, as the sun began its slow descent, Jason and Ellen walked to the far edge of their property, to the place where the old way station had once stood. In the center of the clearing, where the largest stone circle had been, now stood a single, newly carved headstone. It didn't bear one name but 5. Sarah Ward, beloved wife and mother. Elizabeth Samuel and Thomas Blackwood. May they find peace. Jason reached up and unclasped the tarnished silver locket from around his neck. For years it had been a weight, a constant physical reminder of his grief and his guilt. He had given it to Ellen at the start of their journey, but she had quietly placed it back in his hands that morning, as if she understood what he needed to do. With a deep breath that felt like the first clean one he'd taken in 5 years, he hung the locket over the corner of the cool stone. It was an offering, a release, a final goodbye to the ghosts of the past. He was no longer just a man running from a tragedy. He was a father building a future. He had found something far more valuable than Dutch Henley's gold. He had found redemption in the dust. He put his arm around Ellen, and together they turned and walked toward their new home, its windows blazing with the golden light of the setting sun.